Welcome, everyone. This is Carol Scott with the National Ombudsman Resource Center. Today is Tuesday, November the 10th, 2020, and we are recording the fourth session of the new orientation for State Ombudsman. Our speaker today is Louise Ryan. She is the Ombudsman Specialist with the Administration for Community Living, and I'm just going to turn it over to Louise at this point.
Thank you, Carol, and good afternoon, everybody. So just so you know, I think I know most of you, but you may not know me in terms of some of my background. So before I came to ACL, I was the Washington State Long-Term Care Ombudsman for, I think, about 5 years, and was with the program in total about 13, 14 years. So I've been around the ombudsman world a while. And I really have always thought it was, certainly for me, the best job ever. And I hope you'll find that to be true as well. So I understand you may have looked at this PowerPoint. I've changed it a tiny bit. I don't want to read slide by slide. I want to just have hit some highlights and have more of a discussion if you have questions, hopefully. So feel free to, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them during the presentation. So either you can wave your hand, or just when there's a break, I'll try to leave little breaks, pauses, if questions come up. And in this world, there's no such thing as a dumb question, because even with all the years I've been working in the ombudsman world, I can still get stumped by a question, you know? So that's part of what makes the job interesting. A couple things I'm going to hit on. I'm going to talk for a minute or two about ACL in general. I want you to think about your own assessment of the job, of your organizational placement, of the history of the program. All of that kind of bears on how you do your job as state ombudsman. I'm not really going to talk about NORS today because we've had quite a bit about NORS. I'll just give a couple updates for those of you who aren't yet into our new system. I'm going to talk a little bit about when I talk about the functions and responsibilities, I'm going to try to weave in kind of where you're at with COVID-19 and how important the duty that you have and the responsibilities and the functions that you're granted can really help to maximize the resident voice as they navigate through COVID-19. So a little bit different than I've done in the past. Very quickly, the Administration for Community Living is what we call an operating division within the Department of Health and Human Services. When I came to federal service in 2011, I went to the Administration on Aging. And then about a year later, we merged with the Administration on Disabilities and also the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. They were in another federal agency. So we merged to be more of this aging and disability division. And within that, we have other programs that are relevant to the Ombudsman program, like the DD councils, protection and advocacy systems, centers for independent living. We have the technology programs, assistive technology programs. That came on later through another, through Congress, which did some reorganizing for us. We also now have the state health insurance assistance programs. We have senior Medicare patrol. We also have what's called the duals ombudsman program. So we're pretty integrated aging and disability. We also have the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Rehabilitation Research. affectionately known as NIDLR. And NIDLR is kind of like the research arm for disability. So you think of the National Institutes of Health and National Institutes on Aging, and so NIDLR is similar in that way, and they are housed within ACL. So our mission is to maximize the independence, well-being, and health of older adults, people with disabilities across the lifespan, and their families and caregivers. So we really have become an agency that, focuses from the very beginning to the very end of life. So just a few reminders for you. So I am organizationally located within the Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs. I'm the sole full-time staff person in that office. And that is within the Administration on Aging, but just a couple reminders. I am not an ombudsman. And anything that you share with me in writing is potentially subject to Freedom of Information Act. I do have to hand over records if there's a request, generally speaking. So sometimes a phone call is a better approach when you have a sensitive question. Also, just as a reminder that we are an executive branch. So, we have our Cabinet Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. He reports to President Trump. So we are that executive branch, meaning that we do not appropriate funds. That's what Congress does. And that we can't just go and talk to Congress. We can't say, we think you really should support this or that or the other. There's a very prescribed process for our communications with Congress. So thinking of yourself as a new state ombudsman, I want you to take time to be, of course, you've been kind of thrown in at the most unusual time in our history in the middle of a pandemic. But if you can find some time to think about your program, where are you organizationally located and what does that mean? So for instance, are you in state government? That has a set of circumstances. Are you in a nonprofit? That has a different set of circumstances. Are you a centralized or decentralized? Do you have volunteers or not? And what is your program's history of systemic advocacy? And knowing the states that you're from, I have my notions about some of that if you'd like to have one-on-one conversations, happy to do that. It can impact how you proceed in your systems advocacy, the history that you have. See, I'm just going to set my timer for myself. So those are just things for you to, when you can, take a little time to kind of give it some thought. Also, again, some of you came to this with some past experience with the program. Others of you are brand new. I came to the program having been the assistant state ombudsman and followed on the heels of a fairly charismatic, fun-loving and effective state ombudsman who had really good relationships with the legislature. And I found that for me, I had to prove myself because I was being compared to my predecessor. So you may feel some of that as well, depending on your state again. So, I later people said, gee, we underestimated you. It's like, well, thank you for that backhanded compliment. Yes. So, you may or may not be in that kind of situation. So it's just something to keep in mind. And what's your experience in the broader world of long-term services and supports? Did you work in another program, an LTSS program or not? Or are you brand new to that? because that, for me, I came to the program with community-based, home and community-based experience. So I had a good sense of things. But if you were in child welfare or something, you've got a steeper learning curve. So, just more to think about. Also, personally think about what is your comfort with public speaking, with managing conflict, with data, with budgets. All of those are critical aspects of your job. And so if you're not comfortable with public speaking, maybe then you need to go join Toastmasters or find a coach or do something, right? Because you have to gain some confidence in that. If dealing with conflict, ombudsman programs are about conflict. And so how do you manage that? How do you solve conflict? It's a big part of the job. And conflict, of course, we think of with residents and providers, but it can be with residents and families. It can be conflict with your local entities, with your representatives. It's everywhere. And then data and budgets. And I really am expecting all state ombudsmen to look in the new OEP system, even if they don't manually create the report, but that they get into the system, that they become comfortable with it, and that clearly that they review and ideally press the submit button when they submit their report to ACL. And likewise with budgets, if you don't know anything about budgeting, you don't know anything about government finance, then again, I would encourage you to find a class. The Resource Center can provide a lot of helpful information, but the basics of budgeting and what that means is sort of beyond, I think, beyond what we expect of the Resource Center. So, or what I expect. So, think about that, of course, in your spare time, haha. But again, and maybe you learn about budgeting from a fiscal person and ask somebody in your fiscal office to spend a half hour a week teaching you about what you need to know. So doesn't have to be necessarily a class, but there are things that I think you need to figure out how to give yourself some education. I took a class, a workshop training. It was a, I don't know, 2-day training, I think, on legislative and regulatory advocacy, for instance, because I wanted to beef up my skills there. So again, just thinking about your assessment and your agency with your organizational location, what does all that mean? What do you think your barriers might be if you're in a state with a long history where they've not understood the ombudsman program well? And even with the ombudsman program regulations, there's still some lack of clarity. What do people expect of you? Is that expectation on the mark or off the mark? Are there conflicts of interest that haven't yet been resolved? We've tried to address those, but either they aren't quite as resolved as we'd like, or there's changes that have happened that created new conflicts. And what about turnover within your organization, whether it's state unit directors, your representatives of the office? I think there's a lot of that happening right now. Maybe there's been turnover of state ombudsmen, so there's been a lot of instability. So those are things you need to kind of reflect on and identify potential pressure points and where you might want to be proactive in your planning and maneuvering. So, kind of how do you maneuver through those things? Again, so kind of pulling this all together, thinking of your history and skills, your ability to manage conflict, What about turnover? Do you have support in your organization? Those are just kind of more of that assessment. I'm kind of coming back to the same things, but these issues I think are ones that can help you to be successful if you spend some time thinking and then planning, and also finding those people in your organization or outside your organization who you can talk to and get feedback on. You know, I'm going to step into, okay. So a couple other thing around your assessment of your program. First, you have your Office of the Ombudsman, the state office. So who's in your state office? What level of support do you have? I know some state ombudsmen, they're like, I'm it, there's no one else. And that is very tough. But even if you're it and there's no one else, you were hired, so there is human resources somewhere. You get a paycheck, so there is some kind of fiscal office somewhere. You have a supervisor, so there's someone out there somewhere. So you are it in a way, but don't forget that there are all these other behind the scenes resources to try to figure out a way to tap into. The other question is, who is your legal counsel? Are they truly your legal counsel, or are they legal counsel for 10 different agencies where sometimes there could be conflicts and you can't get their attention? So, that's something where, if you're feeling like you don't really have legal counsel to speak of, somebody, when a bill comes through and you want to ask technical questions, you've got a difficult resident issue, you want some advice about approaches. If you don't have that, please let us know at ACL, let me know. My supervisor, Hillary Dolan, was at one time the legal services, legal counsel for the state ombudsman, or no, she worked with the state ombudsman and represented residents, so was a great resource to the state ombudsman. So that's a very near and dear to her heart. And we understand that you might be in a sensitive spot and need to have very confidential conversations. We, certainly when we talk, it is confidential. And we would not go outside of, to your state unit or to other people in your state agency unless that was the approach you wanted. So we're very careful about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about budgeting later, but again, to think of, do you have a sense of how much money is in your program? How does money get distributed? All of that. Are you familiar with your data system, your software for collecting NORS data? I strongly encourage you to learn it and use it, practice. If you work a case, enter it. If you do information and assistance, enter it. Learn how it works, learn how the reports work. Again, training, that's another part of your own training. I suggest you go through your own certification training like anyone else. Go through it more than once if you can. And then I have travel here. So travel, I mean, not only in the world when we could travel to conferences, but can you travel throughout your state? Is there a budget there that allows you, or do you have access and unlimited miles to a state card to get out if you have local entities to get out to those local programs, or if you have staff around the state to get out and, see the state? Because if your state is of any geographic size, you're going to see regional differences. Maybe less so if it's a very small state, but certainly in a larger geographic state, I mean, there's very distinct differences. So things to think about. So COVID-19, two of you have really kind of started in the middle of the pandemic. So thinking of that or any other emergency or disaster, I want to just touch on the functions and responsibilities and how those functions and responsibilities as laid out in the Act and in the rule can help you to and spell out how you represent residents with the goal of protecting their health, safety, welfare, and rights. So I'm not going to read all this fine print, but I want to highlight this number 5 here. And this is really critical when you think of COVID-19. Residents have been cut off. They need a spokesperson. You are that spokesperson to the media, to your state legislature, to your health departments, so that representing the interest of residents before government agencies, that is really critical. And then if you look at number 7, analyze, comment on, and monitor the development and implementation of federal, state, and local laws, regulations, and other governmental policies and actions. So you kind of put 5 and 7 together and you could see how critical your ability to do that kind of work in the middle of COVID is really essential. So, we saw some examples on today's meeting, state ombudsman meeting around, inappropriate limits on people being able to go to the doctor. So how do you work that maybe as a complaint, but it might be it's possibly a broader systems issue that you need to get the health department involved to talk to those facilities and say, here's the safe approaches, for instance. So just thinking of that. I'm not going to read all the fine print. I know Carol sent you a lovely handout with the functions and responsibilities, but I do want to again highlight number 8 and 9, which I think have been pretty essential during COVID. Coordinate with and promote the development of citizen organizations consistent with the interests of residents, and provide technical support for the development of and provide ongoing support as requested by resident and family councils. So I think citizen organizations is a term that doesn't get used a lot anymore. But with COVID, I think there's been a lot more interest in people coming together remotely to get support and to talk about the issues they're facing, whether it's families and having limited access to residents or residents, being trapped in facilities, and concerned people who are concerned about people in facilities. So many states have had very well-attended and engaged virtual resident or family or informational meetings. So again, it's another example of where COVID is really supporting that ability. And you swap out COVID and put a hurricane. Once the hurricane is over, how are you reaching families? And maybe it is through these, or residents. So you're maybe looking at virtual ways to find people. That coordination with other entities becomes really critical during these times as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'm going to stop for a minute just to see if there's any questions. Okay, if there isn't, I don't see anybody anxiously wanting to say something, so I'll keep going on. Just remember, part of your functions and responsibilities, this isn't quite so related to COVID, but that you designate both individuals to be representatives of the office, and if you have a decentralized program, you designate local ombudsman entities. And so I encourage you to take that designation seriously and learn what that means. So A representative of the office, for instance, has very specific functions and duties. They are to investigate complaints. They are to, under your supervision, do other things such as work on systems advocacy as it's appropriate under your direction. So we don't have friendly visitors. We don't have people who are appointed by some other entity to go into facilities under the Office of the Ombudsman. No, you designate and you have the expectation that they fulfill the role of a designated representative of the office. And likewise, in designating local ombudsman entities, you have likely inherited them, which is fine, but you would want to have a review process in place in your policies and procedures to make sure that those entities that are designated now maintain that designation. You can designate and you can de-designate. And whether that's an entity or an individual, it isn't always easy, but sometimes you have to de-designate. We have a whole other session on disclosure of records. So I guess what I want to emphasize here as part of your functions and responsibilities is that you as the state ombudsman have the sole authority to make decisions about releasing ombudsman files, records, and other information. And my rule of thumb is if you get a subpoena, somebody wants your records for whatever, you start by saying no. Maybe you don't say that to them, but you start with the no. No, I don't need to release these records. And then you want to look at, is there a reason why I should release the records? And you are required to have criteria to help you to determine when you should release files, records, or other information. And as a reminder, other information can be your volunteer representative met with a resident and observed a daughter and another resident arguing in the dining room. That's other information. And all of a sudden the lawyer's issuing you a subpoena because, say, the daughter has been banned from the facility and wants to go back in, and all these permutations can happen where the ombudsman is suddenly central to whatever the issue is. So you always want to kind of don't feel you have to release anything. You don't. You absolutely don't, short of a court order. Okay, so you get your state auditor knocking on your door saying, I want to look at your records to make sure you're doing good record keeping. No, that's an absolute no. And we have gone on the record with another state and had to kind of pull out the big guns and say, if you do this, you are jeopardizing your federal funding. So we've taken a hard stance on that. So you get a request for records and you're not sure what to do, feel free to call me. So you stay protective of your records. Of course, there are times when you do want to release. When I say records, I'm talking also about your resident or complainant identifying records. I'm not talking about a report or a de-identified data. So, but that's something, and we can spend more time on this later, but it's really important that you protect your records. Carol, how am I doing for time? Let's see. I have about an hour, right? Okay. I think Carol's on mute, but I just answered my own question. Okay, a couple other things. Fiscal management, I'm going to talk about that later, so I'm going to skip over that. Annual report. I think by now you figured out that you have to submit a report to ACL. We have a new software called the Older Americans Act Performance System, OAPS, And I have to, for most of you, get you signed on, and it's a little bit cumbersome. So I'm hoping, I have no administrative help myself, so I have to make sure I've got all the details so I can send it over to our IT people, and then they will send you an email with to get you set up. So I'm getting there. But the annual report, we call your data collection NORS, National Ombudsman Reporting System. So if you've seen those tables with the case and complaint data collection, the program activities in table 3, that's NORS, right? So that's NORS, and then you report it into the OAPS software. So, and we just changed our NORS in fiscal year 2020. So for the two, well, Carolyn, you probably are familiar with the old NORS. So Lisa's probably the only person who did not experience the old NORS. So I'd say she's lucky. So
Louise, I don't know if you saw Lisa's question.
no,
Should the criteria, and I'm assuming this is the criteria for releasing of records, should the criteria be in our policies and procedures or somewhere else?
Yeah, it could be in your policies and procedures. That's a pretty good place for it. I'd say that's, yeah. I mean, you could have, trying to think how else you might do it. You might have it spelled out in a letter to people. Like when in Washington State, we developed a kind of a template letter and said, here's what we do, here's the restrictions, and here's our criteria to consider releasing information. We actually had a law student at ACL, an intern, who has developed a template. We aren't quite ready to roll it out, and it'll probably come out through the Ombudsman Resource Center. But you may be able to use something like that with instruction to say to your locals, if you get a request, send them this letter, notify me, etc. So there is some procedure you want to have spelled out, and yeah, so.
Thank you. I haven't seen anything like that since I've been here in all 163 days. But
yeah.
So that's why when you said it, it really got my attention, because I haven't even considered how I would make that decision when it comes up, because it's bound to come up.
Yeah, I thought you had something in your policies and procedures because I reviewed them.
I'll go back and look at them.
It might be sort of not that obvious, maybe. Yeah, you eventually you will be asked. I think especially the more people become aware of the program, it seems to increase the requests. And so, yeah, and then hopefully we'll have some extra technical assistance tools in the near future that you can all use to, kind of adapt to your state. I was going to say something else, Lisa, and it escaped my brain. Okay, if it comes back to me, I'll mention it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to mention and remind you that, you are the statewide leader of a very important program, and it's important for you to kind of embrace that and grow in your confidence. And it's going to take a while. I mean, it's a hard job, but, remember that you have power in your authority and duties. You have power in terms of being able to access residents and their records, around disclosure or non-disclosure, designating, systems advocacy. But within that, as I talked earlier about kind of assessing your organization, your state, your history of your state, your knowledge base, you have to be aware of the barriers and how to remedy those. And that's a process. I know there was one of you, your program didn't have policies and procedures ever until a couple of, 3 years ago or something. So some states, before we implemented the regulation, states kind of operated differently and interpreted the Older Americans Act differently. So when the regulation was passed, we worked with states to come into alignment with the regulation. So, so we had states revising policies and procedures, writing them for the first time, fixing legislation, eliminating conflicts of interest. And that work is still going on to some degree, so I'd say that in my view of looking at the states in general, one of the kind of continuing challenges for some states is to really be able to be that visible advocate. That can still be a challenge. COVID has helped some states to be, they're suddenly seeing, oh, the ombudsman is our expert. Let's call on them. Let's have them be more visible. And in others, it's the other way. So we're still kind of working through that with some states. But again, I think, really read through and kind of take to heart and memorize what's in your job in terms of functions and responsibilities. And don't hesitate to call, whether it's your mentor, the resource center, myself. We're all here to support you in this job that can be pretty isolating. I'm going to skip over NORS. You can thank me. Let me think here. But the one thing I do want to mention, and I think thinking of COVID, how you should try to use your data. You all have software systems. You can all run reports. I really think it's a great idea to have a story, have a picture. Obviously, you're getting consent to share a picture and to have a resident story, and then have the data. So I'm just going to give you a quick example. Here's this is more national data, but this has been really effective to show states that look at how the transfer discharge complaints are growing over the years. You can kind of see this boom, 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 growing, right? So showing the little bit of data, having the story, I'm not going to read the story, and with a picture, even better. But this, I will say, this data and this story, ACL used this to educate CMS on how problematic transfer discharges were when they were rewriting their regulations, which is in part why we weren't the only ones, but it's in part why there is now the requirement that nursing homes notify the ombudsman when they're discharging a resident. This is another, just an example. It's Coalition on Homelessness, but I thought it was a great way to share data. I got this as a postcard in the mail. And, you could just see something like this, provided 4,000 information and assistance to residents, held 200 virtual meetings. You can see how you could do something like this. So just a little creative way to share data. Let's see here. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about another part of your functions and responsibilities around developing memorandums of understanding. And I guess I want to find out, are you familiar with what that means? Do you know if you have any in your state? Basically, in the regulation, there's a list of different types of entities that we recommend that you have memorandum of understanding with. So let's see here. I think I'm missing some of them. So does that sound familiar? Lynn, it does. Lisa, yeah, okay. So for instance, and especially thinking about COVID, if you already had an MOU with your state licensing and survey agency about how you would share information, how survey would maybe give your referrals a little more priority, those kinds of things could be especially helpful right now. Or if your MOU says you're going to do your best to meet monthly, those kinds of things can help support when a crisis hits, can help support that communication and flow of information, and also respect for processes. So as things settle down, if you don't have MOUs, you really want to look at how can you get these. There is one required MOU with, and it's a little awkward, it's the legal assistance developer and legal assistance programs. And that is required because it's in the Act. So do you have an MOU with your legal assistance developer?
I don't know. In my state, we are decentralized, so we fall under Department of Human Services. So I'm not positive if the agency has one, but even if the agency does, would this program need to have one as well?
Right. So you as an independent office needs to have an MOU with, for instance, I think your legal assistance developer is probably in state government. Is that right?
They are.
Yeah. So something between the two entities about how they'll coordinate, might discuss things like cross-training, working on systems advocacy. And we have some examples, I think, on the NORC website. And then with the legal assistance programs, which are out in the field, I don't know if they're all one agency or different agencies or how that might work in your state. But I know in the past there was some pretty good coordination around referring to legal assistance. So it might be more about referring residents to the legal assistance programs. So maybe a little different approach at the local level. So, yeah, and we've done some, the Resource Center has some good information on memorandum of understandings and some templates. So another one that I think is helpful to have an MOU with is with Protection and Advocacy or your Disability Rights Agency, especially around information sharing. So those are just some things to add to your list and see where you're at. In thinking of the Ombudsman program rule implementation, and Lynn, I think you know this, but Lisa, you may not know this, that when we implemented the rule, we worked with every state and evaluated every state to see where they were at in terms of compliance with the rule. So it was on an Excel spreadsheet, and you might have it somewhere, Lisa, or I can mail it to you, where we sent kind of our evaluation. The state had to reply with a plan to come into compliance and a timeline. So for instance, one was we didn't see policies and procedures anywhere in Mississippi. So that was a requirement. So that if you want to have a follow-up discussion about that and a little bit more about where you might be with memorandums of understanding, I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Louise, this is Amanda.
Oh, hi, Amanda.
Hello. I just had a couple questions. We're in the process right now of finalizing our MOU with the legal assistant developer and legal services. And it's taken us this long to get it this far.
Yeah.
one thing I've noted is a little bit of resistance from some of the other agencies, such as licensing and certification. Also, our adult protective services, they don't
Mhm.
do it on a state level. They want each one of the AAAs to have their own, which it's run into a problem because I've reviewed the MOUs and half of them fall within the program manual requirements and the other half don't. So
Mm.
I would prefer to have it on the state level.
Yeah.
And can you tell me just a little bit of what would the court one look like, or law enforcement on state level?
Yeah, so let's see, here's the list. I think I got my slides a little turned around. So courts of competent jurisdiction. That one, oops, could be a little tricky in terms of there's a lot of courts out there. And same with state and local law enforcement agencies. There's a lot out there. But perhaps you looked at, well, what are some, rather than trying to get real local, what are some statewide law enforcement agencies? So you could think about the kind of natural one might be the Attorney General Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. So maybe that's where you might have, oh, they're number 6 though. Okay, well, let me back up then. Trying to think. That I would say that and the courts could be more complicated. But you might find opportunity where, so for instance, I was pretty active with the Seattle Police Department. They had, and their King County prosecutor, they had a really strong interest in long-term care facilities. So we never had an MOU, but we had a very strong working relationship. So if you develop those relationships, there might come a time where you'd say, maybe we want to formalize this. So I would say those might be more naturally occurring, but I would also say it would still be from the state office with that local entity. And there might be some coordination that might be your local entity has something complementary, but it can't be. So for instance, if your local AAA wants to have a MOU with law enforcement and they say, we're gonna turn over every suspected abuse issue, including the Ombudsman records, well, that wouldn't work, right? So you've got to make sure that there's that coordination.
Yeah, we have run into that with Disability Rights Idaho. They are wanting information on cases turned over to them, and so that MOU has really drug out.
Did you say Disability Rights Idaho?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's one where it's an interesting dilemma within the same age at ACL. There's sort of a little rub and a little conflict in their regulation and our regulation. Their meaning Ombudsman. So if you want to talk about that one further, if you're kind of just hitting barriers, let me know. We could with the P&A folks, we could maybe bring everybody together and have a chat. So
I think that would be really good, actually, because it actually, Kathy had worked on it to try to put it in place when she was here, and it hasn't moved any further forward. Our relationship has, but the hasn't. So
yeah. Okay.
I appreciate the clarification. Emily, I can see the real advantage of them. I just think that it hasn't been a focus, a strong focus in our state in the past. So it's kind of a challenge with the entities that they don't want to be tied into something.
Yeah.
Thank you, Louise.
And I think the thing to remind people is it's like, this just helps to formalize our communication and our relationship, and it can always be changed. Not that you want to change it all the time, but you know, it's not like a legal document that they are locked into also, you know. So I think maybe helping people to remember that might help, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip over this here because I want to get to fiscal management. So I think, though, I will kind of say, in terms of coordinating, whether it's with legal services or other entities, is that, and I think you probably experienced this, that when you coordinate and work together, whether it's on legal or other, that you can be more effective and get a better outcome for the resident, right? So that's kind of why those MOUs recommendations are in the rule and in the act. And then with regards to some legal services coordination here, there's a few that are on this list right here. What states have done, you know, improving policy or legislation on financial exploitation, improving consumer protections, like, you know, stronger regulations around assisted living or residential care, the task forces or interdisciplinary work groups, all of those, you know, can really pay off. So, so I hope you'll see that this is the best job you'll ever have, and that you'll stick with it for a while and embrace that you have, you know, very unique job. You're the only long-term care ombudsman in your state, right? And you have an office, and so it's very unique. And you have a lot of responsibility and authority, but sometimes it feels like, because you're not an enforcer, sometimes it might feel like you don't have any authority, but you do. You know, you'll always learn and you'll never get bored. And I think Joe, with his 18 years, would attest to that. And Carol, with her many years. You got to pace yourself, especially now, and celebrate your successes. The small ones, the big ones, the in-between ones. Celebrate anything you can. So I'm going to, I don't know if there's more questions right now, or if I'm going to kind of segue into more of a discussion on fiscal issues.
Will you flip back to your slide 24 real fast for me?
Sure. Let's see, there's probably a better way to do it.
It was that little postcard that you'd gotten in the mail.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
and this slide is available, PowerPoint's available. Carol, I'll send you my revised one. I need to just go through and make sure I found, as I've gone through it, found a couple things I need to fix. But yeah, I just thought this was great. I mean,
I think it's so concise. I thought it was so great. So yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate you showing that to us again.
Yeah, and that's something, you know, you can hand out to get a, you know, once we're back to doing, you know, health fairs and that kind of stuff, or to give to the legislature. Yeah, and I think Ohio might have, I know Bev was interested in it. She might have done something not quite like this, but similar. I think I just saw something.
I'm actually thinking that Victor did something like this.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Yeah, so we might have a couple of examples. I also should mention, oh, this is really off topic, but if I can find it, if you don't mind. Hanging on here for a minute. There are some on the Aged website under resources. We have somewhere, we have some graphics. Oh wait, that's not it though. Got to get that one fixed. Okay, we have some graphics. And you are welcome to take these. We have them in Word. I think the Resource Center, do you have these, Carol, in Word? Anyhow, you're welcome to take these.
We're not seeing them. We're still seeing your slide.
Oh,
24.
okay, shoot. Okay, let's see. How do I new share? All right. Boop, boop, boop. Here we go. Share. Okay, do you see this here?
Yes.
It says Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Volunteers.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are on AGID. And so you're welcome to, take this kind of thing and make it for your state. They're under AGID resources. And somewhere we have the Word versions. These are PDF versions. But yeah, so we have these ready-made things. This is national data. So, you could always do a state, state version. Here's complaints. So this is on AGID if you want to look at it. AGID is where we store all of our aging and disability program data. And so it's just, I'm a little off base, but I'm just going to go. So we have these little maps here, data at a glance. And the NORS 2019 data should be posted soon. But this is another thing if you want to look at your data as it compares to other states or, things like that. So anyhow, but in the meantime, let me go back to, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can get my act together and open the other version or the other presentation.
Louise, do we have to have an access code to get into that?
Into AGID? No, it's a public database.
Okay, thank you.
It's just, it's agid.acl.gov. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, share. All right, so let's see, slideshow. Okay, and then I need to swap. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about your responsibility with regards to fiscal management, and then also what the Older Americans Act requires of states and Older Americans Act requirements of the Ombudsman program, the state ombudsman, and state units on aging. And then a little bit about some of the requirements around the allocations of Older Americans Act funds. So when thinking about fiscal management, I'm kind of going back to what I did in the other presentation, kind of where are you at in your knowledge of budgeting, your knowledge of who's in your agency, who helps with fiscal management. How does it work? Do you participate or develop in the budgeting for your office or for your state, for your local entities? Have you been able to make decisions? And I think this really popped up during the CARES Act, when the CARES Act money came out. For instance, some programs were just, here's how we're going to spend the money. Other programs were calling and emailing me saying, they just want to roll it all out to the AAAs. How do I get some of this money for our statewide needs? So we were able to do some individual TA with states on that and remind state units that you are to have a say in the allocation of funds. So how are you involved in how money gets distributed to the local entities, for instance? And do you see the local programs, their budgets? And what kind of monitoring do you have around state and local level spending? So those are just some kind of hints at some of the ways you might be involved and ought to be involved in fiscal management. So it's kind of some questions there. So I've copied this from a recent training that we did, was in the NORS training, but I thought this was helpful, that kind of laid it out that you have 3 distinct responsibilities with regards to fiscal management. So you are to determine the use of fiscal resources, both at the state office and as applicable local ombudsman entities. You are to report funds expended in NORS, and then you are to review and certify that the program met minimum funding requirements in accordance with the Older Americans Act. And that's done typically in the summer by, you would sign the certification of long-term care ombudsman program expenditures. So those are kind of like 3 big buckets. So the Older Americans Act specifically says that you shall be responsible for the management, including fiscal management of the office. And the rule kind of goes a little further and also clarifies that you have fiscal responsibilities of the local ombudsman entity. And so including access to programmatic fiscal information. So for instance, when I was state ombudsman, we kept track, because our program was a little different. We were in a nonprofit and the state gave us all the money and then we distributed all the money. So we could track every month which of our local entities billed, how much they were spending, we approved their budgets, on and on and on. So that was very hands-on, and still is hands-on. Others of you in state government, it might be a little harder to track that down, but that's where getting to know your fiscal staff is really important. So again, this is in your functions and responsibilities under fiscal management, that you determine the use of fiscal resources appropriated or otherwise available for the operation of the office. And where there's local entities, that you approve the allocations of federal and state funds. So for instance, most states, if they have local entities, they have a funding formula for those local entities. And so that would be something that you would approve, that formula. And then, you also are to determine that program budgets and expenditures of the office and local entities are consistent with laws, policies, and procedures governing the ombudsman program. So for instance, if you found out that a local entity was using some of their Title VII ombudsman money to take residents on a special boat cruise and using that funds for that, just to go on an outing, that would not be appropriate use of ombudsman program funds. So that would be a no-no. So those kinds of things you have to kind of have your eye on. And frankly, we know that there's never tons of money, and most of the budget goes for wages and benefits. That's a big chunk of your budget typically. But with that money not going for wages and benefits, how is it being used? And say if you have local entities and you know that the agency's charging for a full-time staff person for the ombudsman program, but they're doing half-time family caregiver support, then that would clearly be an issue you would identify. So you have to keep your tabs on those types of things. This is kind of small print here, and I did this in a hurry, so I need to clean it up a little. But this is also from the Guide 3 guidance that you have for NORS, for Table 3. There's some timing of your fiscal responsibilities. So think about that you develop some policies and procedures around timing of fiscal responsibilities. So for instance, you may want to have a procedure where you review budgets and financial statements monthly, and that you meet with fiscal staff on a routine basis, whether that's monthly, quarterly, every other month, something. So you want to develop those relationships early. So if you don't know who is at your agency, who's in charge of the finances for your program, you want to find out if you don't know. If you do know and you haven't met with them, you want to make an appointment to meet with them. Of course, we know that in January, you've got your NORS report. You have to report funds expended. So you want to start meeting with them now to give them a heads up and talk about how the money was spent last fiscal year and what's it looking like, and are they going to be able to account for that by January. So, okay, I've got to fix this. I just did some rearranging with my slides today, and this is much better here. Okay. And I've talked about this. The other thing I'll mention is with local ombudsman entities, again, you want to have that procedure to conduct routine reviews of their initial budget and then invoices or fiscal reports. Like I know Joe in California, they have a very specific tool that they use when they're monitoring their programs to look at their fiscal management. The other thing is if you have local entities, my experience is we had to get their audits and look at specific parts of the audit to make sure that they were in compliance. So that was just another way that we made sure that those entities were doing things properly. With kind of this timing, I've said it, I'll say it one more time. NORS is coming in January, so hopefully you'll start working on your NORS report soon, but that's when you want to report your funds expended. In July or August, somewhere in there, ACL will send to the state unit a letter called a Certification of Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Expenditures, where you will certify or not that the program met the minimum funding requirements for fiscal year 2019 now. And I'll talk about minimum funding in just a minute. So, like now, so any questions about what I've run through? Any concerns maybe about your ability to access fiscal information?
Do you think that memorandum has already gone out? That usually goes out between July and August. Is that something that I should have seen?
Yes. And we know that some states have not returned them. So sounds like you're probably one of those states. Okay. Yeah, I know the regional administrators were following up on that. So I'll just check in and see. Sounds like you didn't see it.
It's also one that you'd have to sign off on too.
Yeah. You have to sign it. So the Older Americans Act has a couple of requirements for state units on aging that, and it's a little tricky because the, what am I saying? The Older Americans Act was reauthorized in March of 2020, and the minimum funding year requirement was moved from the year 2000 to the fiscal year 2019. So states have to spend on their statewide ombudsman programs no less than what they expended in Title IIIB and Title VII funds for fiscal year 2019. So that means that what we're kind of doing this a little differently. So this year, the certification was, we weren't looking at fiscal year 2019 yet. We were still looking at the year 2000. So we're kind of working to next year develop that baseline of fiscal year 2019. So what that means though is, so if your state, say, spent $300,000 in Title IIIB money in fiscal 19, they have to maintain that minimum for the Ombudsman program. Now, they might next year say, well, we really need our 3B money to go here, but we're going to backfill it with state money. That's okay, they can do that. But they have to meet that threshold of funding. The other thing that the Older Americans Act says is that the state cannot supplant funds. So they can't supplant or replace or substitute for any other federal or state funding. So we had one state that got $100,000 in CARES Act money, but then the state took away $100,000 of state money. And it's like, that might be supplantation. So that's a possible example of what is meant by supplantation, and states cannot do that. There is confusion about minimum funding. You will probably hear people call it maintenance of effort, which does not apply to the Ombudsman program. So there's confusion about that. If you hear maintenance of effort in relation to the Ombudsman program, what they really mean is minimum funding. And minimum funding, it's not, again, it's this language that says funds received under this title. So what that means is that if Title IIIB, I'll use that again, at the state level was $300,000 in fiscal 19, but in future years it was $300,000, but it was a mixture of state and federal, they're still meeting the minimum funding requirement. So maybe down the road they give you $500,000 state, federal, and then later they want to cut you, they can cut you back to that $300,000. So it's, it's a little tricky. We're having to look at fiscal 19 a little more carefully. So stay tuned there. But I guess just remember, minimum funding means the state has to meet the minimum funding that they gave your program in fiscal 19 with federal funds. So Title III, Title IIIB, and Title VII. And there's similar language for area agencies on aging for those states that have AAAs. They have to expend on activities of the Ombudsman program not less than their Title III money expended in fiscal 19. So, okay, so I've talked a little bit about the two pots of money. I probably should have had this first. So just to recap where the authorization comes from, right? So Title III are what we call grants for state and community programs on aging. So that helps to fund caregiver information and assistance, kind of those traditional Older Americans Act programs, and it can also be used for the Ombudsman program. Title VII, Chapter 2, all that money in Title VII, Chapter 2 Ombudsman has to go to pay for Ombudsman program services. Chapter 3, elder abuse, it's a much smaller pot of money. Some states give it to the Ombudsman program, some states split it up different ways. It's not exclusive that it has to go to the Ombudsman program, but Chapter 2 Ombudsman does. Okay, I talked about supplantation. I talked about this. Okay. Another thing is that when we look at Title III and Title VII monies, that are for the Ombudsman program, they don't have to follow the intrastate funding formula. And I don't know, are you familiar with what the intrastate funding formula is? I've
I am.
lost being able to see you. So yeah, so basically the states have to submit to ACL a formula on how they're going to distribute their funds to the AAAs, and ACL approves that formula. So with the Ombudsman program, though, they can use a different formula, and most do. Most use a formula that's more specific to, say, number of facilities, number of beds, square miles, that kind of thing. So again, the Title III and Title VII are not subject to intrastate funding formula. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that. Just a couple other things about Title VII money. It's kind of stating the obvious, but Title VII programs, people can't be coerced into services, and certainly there's no funding for involuntary services under Title VII. This language is in the Older Americans Act. And then also use of the Title VII Ombudsman allotment to fund activities not authorized under Section 12 of the Older Americans Act and conducted by the program is prohibited. So again, if you wanted to start a program to, I don't know, something not related to Ombudsman, and you wanted to use your Ombudsman money, that is prohibited. Okay, let's see, I think I've said that. Again, with Title VII, Chapter 2, that's your Ombudsman money. It has to be used on direct costs of the Ombudsman program, which can include staff, office space, training. It does not require a match, unlike other Older Americans Act programs. But states may wish to request a match at the local level for local entities, but it's not required. The other thing I'd say, there's some confusion around Title VII Ombudsman funds because it can't be used for administration of the state plan on aging. So sometimes people get that administration language mixed up with administrative costs. So the Title VII funds can be used really for things that you need to run the Ombudsman program, right? Or the office. So if you need fiscal, you need HR, you need an office space, you need a computer, that all supports the Ombudsman program. Those are permitted costs. But if they want to take 15% off the top of your Title VII money to go towards state plan on aging, their state aging plan development, for instance, that would not be allowed. So, oops, I gotta fix that. So just as a reminder, a couple things, minimum funding, I have to fix this at the 2019 level. Some other basics, states can't supplant Title VII, Chapter 2 Ombudsman money. Title VII, Chapter 2 must be spent on the Office of the Long-Term Care Ombudsman program, or the program. States do have flexibility with Title IIIB. And every summer you need to certify your expenditures with your state unit. And again, this is complicated. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to call. And this would be a time when calling to ask fiscal questions might be better than an email. And then there might be a follow-up email where you get things on the record. So yeah. And I need to clean up these slides because as I started playing with them today and rearranging, I goofed. So let me clean these slides up and I'll get it to you, Carol. I believe Carol will have them on the protected side of the website. Is that right? Yeah. Great. Any questions?
I just have one more question.
Mhm.
So when you said that the states have flexibility with that Title 3B money,
Mhm.
so I've seen, we give money to AAAs,
Yeah.
and I was reviewing one of the AAAs, just their budget and,
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
trying to get my head
Right.
around it.
Great. Yeah.
And so when I asked about I wanted to know how the ombudsman were funded, because we have several people who are part-time.
Mhm.
And so say if they're part-time and they only work 4 hours, but then they only have 2 hours to dedicate to the ombudsman program because they're doing 2 hours worth of something somewhere else. So I said, well, why can they do that? Because number one, programmatically, that doesn't seem to work. You can't
Right.
visit
Yeah.
a facility and
Yeah.
do anything in a 2-hour window, particularly in rural areas. You're gonna have to drive 30 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the answer was, well, only part of their salary comes out of the ombudsman program. The other part of it comes out of Title 3B, so they have flexibility. Well, I'm not okay with that. I mean, I get it that it's
Yeah.
legal, but programmatically, that math doesn't work for me.
Right. So there's structural issues there, and then following that is the budget. So yeah, if they're saying the 3B money at the AAA level, 2 hours worth of wages is ombudsman and 2 hours is something else. I mean, technically they can do that, but you're identifying the practicality of that doesn't work. That's not enough. And so that sort of takes on a different issue. And then it becomes, and when I say they have flexibility, they still have to meet their minimum funding, right? So if they were giving $20,000 a year towards the ombudsman program, they have to maintain that even if they use different sources of funds. So, but yeah, this is more around the effectiveness and, how to build a stronger program there. Is that one where there's multiple people in the agency, quote, working on the ombudsman program, or is it just one person?
They have one full-time
Mhm.
and 5 part-time,
Oh,
and none of the part-times do all of their hours on ombudsman.
yeah.
Just
So, yeah. And then, then there's things like, is there any conflicts of interest? Have they been fully trained and designated, or are they these sort of shadow people? So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So
yeah, okay.
we can
Well,
have some chats. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah. And let's see. And Michael, good to see you. Hello.
He's on mute.
Yep. And he doesn't have local entities, so some of that might have been.
Yeah, I'm off.
Yep. So
Look very studious.
yeah, it's got a
Look at all those
library.
books behind you. Yeah.
This is my friends, all of them.
So Michael, with your, I'm just curious, put you on the spot. So you don't have local entities, you're a centralized program, and
Correct.
unique in that your state is so geographically large. So you don't really have local entity challenges, but
No, I don't.
you have your staff spread out across the state. And then are you able to see the statewide budget and how that plays out?
You know, that's been a little bit of a difficulty for us. We have pushed our finance folks. In fact, today was the first a coherent report that I've seen.
Yay.
Yeah.
All right, progress, celebrate.
We had to get it in such a way, and what we're having to do is to run duplicate books basically for ourselves. They have
Mhm.
determined what they're doing, and I need to be able to track for managerial purposes
Mhm.
what's going and
Yeah,
taking place there. So I think that we're on a fresh start.
good,
See
great,
how that plays out.
wonderful. Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Not an easy feat in a large state with, yeah, yeah.
What state is Michael?
Florida.
Oh, wow. Mm,
Yeah, that's great.
mm.
Yeah, it's about time to build a ark down there, it looks like.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
I'm looking for gopher wood at 40 cubic links. In fact, while we're talking, they're cutting a tree off my shop
Oh, wow.
from Sally.
Huh. Yeah, are any facilities having to evacuate or? has there
No,
been- Good.
no, and with this ETA that's coming through, it's just some high winds. But
Okay,
there's no, one of the things that's interesting, they say, well, our building is, certified for a hurricane force status. I said, oh, that's good, but the trees are not.
right, right.
Your building is, it won't blow away, but the trees will tear it up.
All on it. Yeah, yikes. Yeah,
Been a year, I tell you.
yeah,
Louise, I can't thank you enough.
yeah.
Everything that you have said is stuff that people need to know. It is a lot, and
Yeah,
you've done the best job of trying to help people figure things out. And I think the bottom line is that your availability, if
Mhm.
people have questions,
yeah,
is key. And of course, the Resource Center will help when they can, but some of these fiscal issues, it really is, it's good for them to know that you are a resource for them. So we're gonna call it a day,
Mhm.
and as soon as we can, we'll be sending out an email that has the slides, the recording, and a link to the evaluation survey, and then the slides and the recording will be on the private side under webinars and calls under New State Ombudsman. So thank you all for joining us. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Louise.
Well, thank you
Yep.
very much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Louise.
it.
okay.
Thank
take
you, Carol.
care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.